with the Missouri House of Representatives, please welcome to the stage Elijah Haahr and Biz 417's Gary Whitaker.
Good afternoon. Thanks all of you for being here and putting up with the snow. If you want to put on your calendar a bad weather day next year, just look and see when we're going to plan Biz 417, and we'll guarantee it. No. Today we're going to talk about some transportation firsts and some historic firsts in Missouri. But first we're going to start with an historic first in Missouri politics, and that is the fact that our guest today is the first Speaker of the House in the history of Missouri from Springfield, Missouri. So help me set the stage. We know there's an arch in St. Louis because the westward expansion with Lewis and Clark started there. The Santa Fe Trail has its roots in Missouri. The Pony Express started in Missouri. The birthplace of Route 66 is in Missouri. There is proof that the interstate system first miles were produced in Missouri. What else? What am I missing? Oh, you mentioned a bridge.
Yeah, the first steel suspension bridge in North America was the Eads Bridge that was laid in Missouri.
Okay, so you are on a mission to make us the first in the future of transportation by bringing the Hyperloop to Missouri. Tell us what is the Hyperloop and how will that work?
So the Hyperloop is essentially something that was sketched out on a napkin by Elon Musk several years ago. The idea is that much like when you go to a bank and you put the thing into the tube and it goes to the bank, it would work much the same way, except you take all the oxygen out of the tube and you can glide through that area using magnetic levitation at a fraction of the cost and at a massive amount of speed, minimal amount of fuel. And so he sort of sketched it out and then went along the way and started doing other stuff, and other people started to run with the technology. And so a few years ago, Virgin built a 0.5 kilometer Hyperloop track in the Mojave Desert about 40 minutes east of Las Vegas. And they started running tests, and they've run about 250 test runs through it. And what they've shown is that the technology works. And so I went out there a couple years ago with the president of the University of Missouri, with the state's economic development director. We got to walk into the tube, we got to see the technology, we got to meet all the engineers that were sort of creating it. And we started to get excited about this. And as you mentioned, Gary, Missouri has historically always been kind of on the forefront of transportation. That's always been sort of the thing that we've prided ourselves on. We have not really had a big innovative move in transportation since the interstate system. And so if you think about how much life has changed since we built the interstate system, since Dwight Eisenhower was president, not just like in TVs, but in cell phones and the internet, every other part of our life has changed dramatically, but we still drive on the same roads and we still drive in the same planes, and we haven't really changed the game when it comes to transportation. And because of Missouri's background, it seems like something that we should again be excited about and sort of try to be on the forefront. And so myself, a variety of people in Kansas City and St. Louis and Columbia have sort of been on this mission to once again put Missouri back into that forefront of innovation transportation.
Just to add a little more historic pressure to your mission, I think the Lindbergh transatlantic flight was called the Spirit of St. Louis because we were seen as sort of the forefront of transportation and trying new things. And then out of St. Louis, some of the components that ended up being in the Apollo mission came out of Missouri. So what are the steps? I mean, how do we get from what you saw in the desert to putting it into place and actually having it come to fruition?
Right. So aside from just the fact that historically we have this sort of natural mission as a state, when we started to get excited about this idea, Black and Veatch and Olson did a study, and it was the first of the kind in the nation that sort of looked at whether or not this would be feasible to do in Missouri. And they looked essentially at a track that would connect St. Louis and Kansas City. And what they found is that topographically, it's pretty flat, it's pretty straight. It connects 3 states between Illinois, Missouri, and Kansas. It connects 2 major metropolitan areas. It has the University of Missouri, which has a large engineering program right in the middle of it. And so for all those reasons, we are sort of especially well placed to build the first track. And so last year, I put together a blue ribbon task force of some government officials, and I asked the lieutenant governor to run it, and then some private individuals. And they sort of looked at, okay, if the technology works, what would be the step to building the first full track in Missouri? And so they came out with the first of its report last fall. And the funny thing is now you've got Florida just announced that they're starting their own panel to look at this stuff. And so other states are starting to try to emulate what we did. But they essentially came out and they said that they built the test track in the desert. The next step in the process before you get to a full track is what's called a certification track. And that's going to be about a 6 to 10 mile track. And in that track, you can start to figure out all the regulatory work that will go into this. So for instance, we don't know if it'd be governed by the Department of Transportation or the Department of Energy because both of these are going to have a fairly significant impact on those two fields. And so Virgin announced last fall that they were going to basically open up a request for proposals from areas around the country to bid on or essentially try to be the place to build the first certification track. And this Blue Ribbon panel said, we're really well equipped for it. Here's the ways we could do it. And so both Kansas City and St. Louis have now put forward proposals. I talked to the people at VHL, Virgin Hyperloop, just last week, and they said both Kansas City and St. Louis are through to the second round. Their plan is to announce probably about 5 finalists sometime in February or March, and then they'll have a final location by the summer. And our thought is this. One, building a certification track, the first of its kind in Missouri, whether it's in Kansas City or whether it's in St. Louis, makes us sort of like the focal point for research and design. It puts us back in the forefront of being a sort of tech-heavy place that both millennials want to come to, but a lot of students want to come to be a part of that. And then also, when you build the first full-length Hyperloop track, you are not going to start back at mile 1, you'll start at mile 11. And so if we build a 10-mile track in Kansas City or a 10-mile track in St. Louis, it puts us basically in the driver's seat to get the first full-length track. And so that's sort of the process that we're on right now. The Kansas City and St. Louis proposals are extraordinarily different. St. Louis has one that essentially would run from the airport around 270 and over into Illinois. Kansas City has an old rail yard that's been essentially abandoned that they own, and they're just willing to turn over to start this process on. So very different applications. And the nice thing is that we've been on this process for so long. I met the co-founder of Hyperloop last spring in New York. We talked about it. I've been out to LA. I've been to the desert. We've been on this since the beginning. Now, since Richard Branson announced last fall that they were going to do this proposal, they've been inundated with all of these groups that now want the Hyperloop certification track in their state. And he told us when we were in LA, like the governor of West Virginia sent the state plane out, picked him up, flew him back to West Virginia to show him the track that they want to do. Like everybody suddenly is very excited about this. But I think, obviously we've been on this from the beginning. We geographically have a really good pitch to make. And then the other thing is that with the Hyperloop, we all think about people moving in the Hyperloop. And everybody's excited because you can go from St. Louis to Kansas City in 25 minutes or Kansas City to Denver in an hour. But most of the private investment, everything about the Hyperloop has been private investment. Most of it has been from ports companies that want to figure out how to move goods faster. Because that's where you can make up so much money, is if you can move goods from one place to another really quickly. So they've had a $200 million investment from a Dubai ports company because they want to figure out how to move these goods around the world faster. Well, Kansas City is the #2 rail hub in the United States. St. Louis is #3 and Chicago's #1. So when Texas wants to bid on this and Ohio wants to bid on this and North Carolina wants to bid on this, we have, once again, another advantage where we can say, listen, if you build it here first, we can start moving the goods here first and sort of offset whatever costs you have associated on the front end with the goods that we can move.
So this is about the future, today is about the future of 417 land. I hear Hyperloop from Kansas City to St. Louis, 30 seconds and moving all this.
30 minutes.
30.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Sorry.
It's not Star Trek.
30 minutes. I was projecting to 5 billion years from now.
Okay. Perfect.
No. So why should we here get excited about a Hyperloop between Kansas City and St. Louis?
Well, I think the first thing is if you think of it, like if West Virginia builds a Hyperloop, a big pitch is North Carolina wants to build a Hyperloop from Raleigh to Washington, D.C. If they do that, and we're probably talking 8 to 10 years away. We're talking 30 years before we get the track. But if they build it from Kansas City to St. Louis, they're going to start to spider web out from there. They're going to go to look at Denver and Chicago and Atlanta and Minneapolis. We're going to be right in the middle of that. So we're going to have access to that much quicker. And the second part is when they build this track, when they built the track in the Mojave Desert, they were using Nevada steel companies and Nevada engineers. Like, of course, they bring in some of their experts, but all of it starts there. What we've got, if you want to go to like Flex Laters at Leggett and Platt down in Joplin and all the stuff they do, or Paul Mueller with its steel, or Custom Metal, all of the types of industry that we have in Springfield would be part of what they'd be utilizing to build this track across the state. And so I think it'd have a huge economic impact here, and then we'd also have the opportunity to be on that track way before everybody else in the country. And then, if they decide to build from Kansas City to Denver, you don't have to fly to Denver. You just drive to Kansas City and hop on and be over there in an hour. Not 5 seconds, but close.
All right. In the Bible, Elijah is a prophet and a miracle worker. So how did you latch on to this as a pet project for Missouri?
Well, if you know about Elijah, he goes to heaven in a chariot of fire. So this is my hyperloop of fire that I'm going to It's just, I'm fortunate. When I got to be speaker, I was the youngest one in the country. And so a lot of the stuff that I've, just by nature of my age, I focus on things that I sort of are the things that next generation will be really big. And this was something that caught my interest really fast, both the history of the state, our geographical footprint, and then if you have the opportunity to go out and see what they've done, watch the videos of these test tracks, it's amazing, the concept of how they do it. And I presented last year in New York on this with the co-founder, and it was funny because he was talking about, they've got this half-kilometer track. They want to build a certification track that's 10 miles. But he said, when a full track is built, he said, our idea is it'll take 15 miles to get up to full speed because they're going to top out somewhere around 800 miles an hour inside the tube. And he said, our idea is that you could sit there with a martini glass and never spill a drop as you went. Of course, I'm like, well, I'm from the Midwest. We won't spill our coffee in the Midwest. But the idea is that it would be something that would just completely change everything. And I don't know if, Gary, if you'll be alive when we have the opportunity to ride on one of these, but certainly I'll be alive when
Okay.
it's a roasting as well as just a discussion.
So we can follow the progress. What's next? What's the next step?
So the next step is probably sometime in the spring they're going to announce the finalists for this. And they've sort of been very close to the vest about how many they're going to announce. But my guess is they'll probably...
Who are we looking to?
I'm sorry, they would be Virgin Hyperloop. They will announce and my guess is somewhere around 4 to 7 finalists that they're sort of considering for a certification track. Jay Walter, who's the CEO, he took over as CEO last January. He used to run mass transit in New York City, London, and Hong Kong. And he came on last January to sort of take the test track to the certification phase and then to the full phase. And so he flew to Missouri last fall. He went to Kansas City, to Columbia, St. Louis, and he actually flew down to Springfield. And he got kind of to see the state. And but they're going to announce probably 4 to 7 finalists sometime in the spring, and then they'll do one more trip to each one of those, and it's sort of your final pitch on it. And I've talked to both the people in Kansas City and the people in St. Louis. Both are extraordinarily high on their plans. It helps that we've been in this space since the beginning. In fact, when we went out to the Mojave Desert a year and a half ago, we were the first government officials to go visit the track that were not from Nevada. Like, we were out there before anybody else and sort of excited about that. And so they recognize how much we are committed to this sort of being the long haul. They get the fact that we have this nice thing. And then for them, aside from sort of moving goods and stuff, they also, if you build a track in Raleigh, you're backed up against the ocean. If you build it in Missouri, you have so much flexibility about where you go in the country. And so there's just a variety of different reasons why Missouri makes sense, whether it's in Kansas City or St. Louis, to build that certification track and to build that full track for the future of the company and the future of the technology.
When governments, cities or states are looking at attracting, an Amazon to move there or a baseball stadium to be built, it ends up being a private-public part. How does Missouri step into the gap to help Virgin make a good decision?
So there's been a few things we've done. One, we've had a bill that's sort of been moving through the process, and it was actually the first bill that came out of the committees this year, and it's on the calendar now, that would basically write into the Missouri Public-Private Partnership statute the use of Hyperloop. And so that would sort of give us, because right now, this sort of technology isn't even contemplated by the statutes that we have. And so that's one of the first things that we've done, and Virgin has noted that, and they said, there's very few other states that have even contemplated putting that in a statute until we decide to build a certification track there. So that's one thing. We've had MoDOT that's been very engaged in our conversations with them about how it would look, because particularly if you took it from Kansas City to St. Louis, you would just want to run it right down I-70. You wouldn't want to get into like building a whole new track through the middle of nowhere. You want to follow where the Missouri interstates are. And so that's a second thing. And then the third thing is we've sort of just had the full pitch about here's why us in the middle of the country, geographically, topographically, wherever you want to go, there's a variety of reasons that it's best for them. And so they've been to Kansas City, they've been to St. Louis. The mayor of Kansas City, Quentin Lucas, he's actually been out to Virgin to meet with them as well and to sort of informally pitch Kansas City. The St. Louis group that's working on it, they've actually taken 3 trips out there. Like, it's been a very holistic effort. At some point, Kansas City and St. Louis will get to that point where, hey, ours is better than yours. I don't care if it's as long as it's in Missouri. I think it's beneficial to Southwest Missouri and the state as a whole if just one of those places gets in.
Talk a bit about the visit to the Mojave Desert. What did you see? Were you able to see something in action?
Yes. So we went out there, and we flew into Las Vegas, and you take a bus 40 minutes east into the desert, and you're driving through just nothingness, and all of a sudden you see this long white pipe, and it's just all on its own. And there's a couple of buildings out there. We met the engineers, we went into the pipe, they did a test run while we were out there, so we got to see sort of that in action. And the interesting things you don't think about is they talked about the first test run they ever did. They had the pod, and they set up some cameras that are attached to the pod inside the track to watch as the pod moved. But then what they do is they take all the oxygen out, and as soon as they did that, they burned up the cameras really fast. And they said, things like that we had not contemplated that happened. And so when we got to be out there, we watched the test run, and then what they do is they open it up and they sort of release oxygen back in, and then we got to walk into the tube and walk down the tube, and they showed us essentially if there's a problem with it, they have doors that will drop down and seal it off. They oxygenate that portion, they do the fixes, they pull it back out and suck all the oxygen out again.
So if the loop from St. Louis to Kansas City makes sense because we already have the right-of-way along I-70, would a next step be, because Route 66 sort of paved the way for the right-of-way that became I-44, would that be a logical next step? And
that would be, once you build that first track, and once you have people and goods traveling back and forth, then it's just going to be, essentially everybody's going to be sort of bidding on how fast can we get the track to connect to us. And I think, obviously, especially if you look at the I-49 corridor that goes from Kansas City down to northwest Arkansas, then all the way down to New Orleans, how it's such a huge corridor for goods. If you did that where you traced along I-49, suddenly be coming down to Joplin, and we'd be right in the middle of it all.
Yeah. We saw some statistics yesterday from the airport to talk about, we talk about, it's fun to imagine a 30-minute ride between Kansas City and St. Louis, but it's really the cargo that is the upside. And we saw at the Springfield airport, the increase in cargo coming through here via air was like up by 3 million pounds or something. And I told Elijah, I think 1 million of that was my wife's Amazon packages. So that's the real upside. Yeah. Mm-hmm. If a Hyperloop gets approved between Kansas City and St. Louis, will it be finished in my lifetime? Because you're the prophet, so.
Well, luckily, our lifespan is increasing dramatically, and so I'm sure in your lifespan you'll have the opportunity to ride on it. I think so. If I had to sort of guesstimate, I would say that we will probably have a certification track, whether it's in Missouri or somewhere else, will be built in the next 2 years, and then I would estimate probably in the next 10 we will have a full-length Hyperloop in the United States. I think within the next 5 or 6 years they will probably build one in India. They want to connect Mumbai and Pune, which has about 20 million people, about 70 miles apart, and the amount of goods and people that would need that because the roads there are not good. They were sort of in the process of getting started, and then they went through an election process there, and so they're sort of waiting for that to all be sorted out. But I would say certification track within 2 years, a full-length track built probably within 10.
Wow, great. All right, please help me thank Elijah Haahr, the Missouri's first in the history of Missouri's Speaker of the House from Springfield, Missouri. Thank you.